Welcome, everyone. We're glad to have you here at the Indigenous Farming and Land Stewardship on Turtle Island session. Thank you so much for being with us. We wanted to let you know that today we really want to invite you to be in circle with us, to chat with us. And what that means, though, is we are purposefully not going to use the chat function while speakers speak, so we can engage in really deep listening. We want to welcome you to this circle and to be with us in this conversation and to invite folks to hear what's about to be shared. My name is Farzana Sarang. I am with Castanea Fellowship. We are a program dedicated to supporting leaders to work to build a more racially just, sustainable, and healthy food system. We are strategically multiracial, and part of our beauty is that we have the opportunity to learn alongside Indigenous leaders, some of whom you will meet today. And this is about them. And so let me get out of the way and introduce these beautiful people. I want to introduce Rowan White with Native American Food Sovereignty Alliance and Sierra Seed Farm and Seed Bank. She is also board chair of Seed Savers Exchange. And we'll be chatting you some links if you want to learn more about Rowan. I also want to introduce Elga Garza, Executive Director of Agricultura Network and Chair of New Mexico Food and Policy Council. And I also want to introduce Chris Newman, who is working with Sylvanic. Wow, I need more coffee this morning. Sorry, you all. Chris Newman, who is working with Sylvanic Farms on new Indigenous food economy in the belly of the beast near DC. So you will be able to learn about all of them more through the chat. And to start us off, the aunties voluntold Chris Newman that he's going to start us off with a story. So Chris, take us away.
I'll do the best I can. Thank you everybody for being here. Thank you, Farzana, for getting me involved in this and subjecting me to the enormous imposter syndrome I have now with Helga up there and Rowan down there. I'm like, why am I here? But I'm going to do the best I can. So when we were talking about what this session would be, we were bouncing around what is going on with Indigenous people in this moment around sustainable agriculture, conservation, and just kind of the movement or the moment we're in when it comes to food sovereignty and sustainable agriculture. And there was just a story, kind of an unfortunate story from my life and from my business that's happened recently that really, for me, sums up what it is to be Native in this space and at this moment. And it was an opportunity that came up to help a fairly wealthy landowner turn their multi-hundred acre property that's right near us, maybe 20, 25 minutes away, to heal and restore this place and turn it into a part of the community. And this landowner, they're kind of versed in what you hear coming out of the regenerative agriculture movement. They wanted to go slow. They wanted to, I think the term they used over and over again was deep listening and deep learning. And they wanted to do something with this landscape that really, wove it into the place, into the particular place it was in, and in the communities that it was in. Not only the kind of overwhelmingly rural white population that's down there, but the African American community down there, the fairly small Indigenous community that's in that area, et cetera. And they wanted to develop this place under regenerative guidelines in a way where that was done appropriately, where place was centered in that discussion. And so they'd been speaking to a regenerative design group out in New Mexico, which is a thing that happens because when you come into this space, white voices tend to be the only ones that pop up first in the Google searches and in Amazon where you're looking for literature and trying to gain an understanding of this. So it's a pretty forgivable thing. Like that's happened to me. There's a reason why my chicken tractors look like Joel Salatin's chicken tractors, because I came in from the outside, and the first people you find on the top are going to be, a certain set of people. But she got introduced to us through a mutual friend of ours, and it became quickly and immediately apparent that my team was able to do everything any other regenerative design firm, consultancy, farm guru, like whatever, like we have all that capability. and then some, because unlike them, unlike most of them, we actually run a profitable commercial operation in a sustainable context. But they just basically wouldn't move forward with us. They were paying everyone but us. When it came to talking about the property and plans for the property with us, they wanted to have conversation after conversation after conversation after conversation. They wanted to introduce us to people. They wanted to perhaps provide access to one person or another, but they were doing everything but cutting checks, which they were happily doing to this group all the way across the country that knows nothing about this place. So you have a person who is professing a desire to centralize how important it is for this place to be integrated into the community. But the only people who can do that, who just happen to be an Indigenous and Black-led organization, suddenly the hand that writes the checks just stops working. So that's, and we tried to explain why this was a problem, and we needed to work, to get paid in order to keep doing this work. And we couldn't just have conversation after conversation after conversation, because our time is valuable. It's all time that we could spend doing something else. And eventually we just could not get this person to the point of writing a fairly small check as a matter of good faith to say, hey, compensate us for our time so we can keep working for you, because you're writing checks for everybody else. And the deal just kind of fizzled. They were assembling this board of regenerative ag superheroes like Kiss the Ground and Farmer D and all these people who were having some issues now because of things we'll probably talk about later. But at the end of the day, it was it was just a non-starter. What I'm finding being Indigenous in this space right now is that getting traction in regenerative agriculture right now almost requires a kind of white passport. And it was funny because the person who worked with me on this project on my team, she's probably the whitest woman in America. She's a blonde girl from Wyoming. And she was the one that told me, the only difference between you and the other people that you're paying, the only thing that they're bringing into this project is their whiteness. They have no expertise that we don't. They have no skills that we don't. We have everything they do and then some. And still, we were being asked to give twice as much to get half as much in return. And I think that's the moment we find ourselves in, where regenerative agriculture is seen as this kind of silver bullet to save the world from capitalism, from colonialism, from all these things. But I'm sorry, my dog is panicking because there's a little bit of thunder outside. Hi, buddy. They see it as this silver bullet, but they can't imagine not being the center of the story.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm going to wrap up real quick, but we're seeing this moment now where a lot of people are kind of getting caught. These outfits are getting caught with their pants down, like what you're seeing with Kiss the Ground, and who it turned out was on their advisory board, somebody that was storming the Capitol last week. We've been trying to tell people that you can't compartmentalize the racist parts of regenerative agriculture and expect it not to eventually infect the rest of the body. And you're seeing the reconciliation being this thing where people are asking, okay, how can we be more inclusive? How can we include Indigenous people? How can we include Black people? How can we include marginalized people in this movement? But they're saying it and framing it in a way that in my ears says, how do we get to appropriate these technologies, these tools, and this worldview, and still, as white people, be the center of the story, with y'all maybe riding in the sidecar and getting something if we decide you get it. So I think that's the moment we're in. And I'm going to kick it back to Farzana to ask the rest of the questions.
Yeah, no, I think that's quite real. And that's part of what I enjoy about the Castaneda Fellowship is we keep it real and we're able to talk about race as it actually interacts with us in our lives. And especially if we want to center around indigeneity, I think something you brought up is the value of it, as we all know, for regenerative agriculture, and then how it is valued is completely different. And so there's this huge disconnect, and you were clearly in the right space with Elga and Roa and Chris. Yes, you belong here with their faces next to you. And I'm also excited to hear, to hear from them, because he's laid the groundwork for opening this conversation. And what are you all experiencing in this current moment of time as sort of culture, economies, power, and paradigms shift? And what are you envisioning as necessary for your vision that puts us in a future where we're in right relations, right? There's so much harm that's been done. There's so much to redo. And there's still this like white passport that Chris talked about. So in your work, Elga, I'm curious, how are you experiencing this current moment? And what do you envision is necessary for the future to put us in right relations?
Well, what Rowan just explained, I mean, it's the same scenario for us here on the local. And it has been ongoing. And I feel those words of sustainable and regenerative, I mean, those have been the growing methods of our ancestral knowledge of how we grow food. And so now they're the buzzwords, but if on a ancestral method of growing food for community has always been at the core of our teachings, intergenerational teachings. Mm-hmm. And for 20 years, I farmed in a militarized zone on the southernmost tip of the US-Mexico border, Brownsville, Texas, bordering with Matamoros, Tamaulipas, Mexico. But at those 20 years, we had to rely on the rains, the tropical storms. Why? We could pump 1,700 gallons of water a day, which sounds like a lot, but it isn't. But the water was so contaminated that we could not use it in farming. We could not use it in drinking. It was linked to birth defects. So these are all of the pieces that we continued to work with nature and work with those intergenerational teachings from generation to generation. So for us here, I mean, we're in the same as Rowan. They want to change our narrative. I can give you an example quickly. Right now, within policy work, we're trying to, we introduced a bill called the Healthy Food Finance Act. And the language was so solid to keep it equitable, to keep it to marginalized Native, Black, and Brown communities. And when we took the language to the roundhouse, they were like, oh no, you got to take this out and you got to say this and got to, you know, and we were like fighting tooth and nail to keep our language and our narrative in there. USDA, always, or not even always, not just USDA, but many other funding sources on a governmental level, always identify us as disadvantaged farmers. And that is the wording they wanted us to use in the bill. And I'm like, we're not disadvantaged because we lack farming ancestral knowledge. We're disadvantaged because our land was stolen. Our water resources were contaminated. Our seeds were compromised. So if we're disadvantaged, it is for those reasons that white capitalist society has put on us. So now that's the language that identifies us. And again, who are the caretakers? Seed preservers. Who are the ones that are still practicing the same farming methods from our ancestors on how to preserve, on how to live with the land. And I've been asked several times, like, okay, well, what does sovereignty mean to you in food? I said, sovereignty in food to me means it is still spiritual in that realm. And when we look at it in that way, it is marked by our ceremonial agricultural calendars, where we ask for the rain, where we bless the seeds, where we beginning to turn the soil. All of our ceremonial calendars are based around that agricultural system. How we honor the changes in the seasons. So for me, in our space and time right now, it is really to say We have been here. We continue our legacy as traditional farmers, and we continue our legacy on how we feed our communities and how we work on a communal level. And in closing, for all of our ancient trade routes and for all of our alliances of migration, which we all have a migration stories, I will say, Ichklancinco en Tuteotatzi, Ichklancinco en Toteopilsin, Ichklancinco en Toteo Yewatzini Panemuani, Totatzini Niwikateo Pincitecutli en Atzatlan, Ipanemuani en Tomanchan Yayolomi en Tlatipac, Yayolomi en Tlatipac. And I say those languages through all the genocide that we have been put through. I speak 3 languages, but that is my native language. The other 2 languages were forced on me. So with that, I say those words in honor of that long legacy, that we continue to be here and we continue to farm, we continue to build relations with all of our native communities, allies, families in Turtle Island. Thank you.
Thank you, Olga. Rowan.
Thank you, Helga, for your beautiful words, and for the prayer that you brought into the space, and for bringing, calling and invoking your ancestors and their brilliance. That's, I think, the foundation that I would like to, sort of address you all in the circle today, is recognizing that, the world that we're asked to inhabit today is one of cultural insanity. We can all be abundantly clear that we are seeing the violence of disconnection on, just in proportions never before seen, I think, and it's just an accumulation of so much undigested grief of disconnection and diaspora. And we are, we're in a crisis of culture, I think, right now. And what we have to remember, in the title of this, even in this panel, in this workshop, is we're talking about Turtle Island. And what that roots us back to is that we are on First Nations land, Turtle Island, connecting us back to a cosmovision and a cosmology of many of the first peoples of North America, who understand their innate relationships and responsibilities and agreements to the very land and all the relations that inhabit that land. We have an incredible memory and a bundle of ancestral brilliance that each one of these panelists bring to their work, which is something that those, consultants in regenerative ag don't have. That is something that they don't bring to the table. And so I think that we will be in no better place in regenerative ag, in making, food systems change, until there's a possibility that a culture of people can emerge that understand it's not just what we do, but it's how we do it, and understanding that we cannot compartmentalize all of these things into just us, techniques and tools, that there's a whole cosmovision that accompanies this. And so things that I'm thinking about a lot in my work is, how can we cultivate, as Indigenous peoples, the ancestral brilliance that we bring? My ancestors, on the record, at the beginning of, this idea of America, during the Revolutionary War, General Sullivan, upon orders of George Washington, was ordered to burn down cornfields in Western New York. And it was said on those papers that they burned over 1 million bushels of corn. And that is pre-industrial. That is the brilliance of my ancestors using people power, using their incredible innovation to grow mass amounts of food for the people as beneficiaries, the land as beneficiaries, all of our relations as beneficiaries. And so I think the question of the hour now that we're in, we want to talk about climate chaos, and we want to talk about, late stage capitalism and the failings of that, and all of the incredible blowback that we're feeling now, how can we cultivate an economy, a regenerative, truly regenerative economy that's a reflection of our Indigenous values? And it's possible, right? It's very possible. It's very possible to build an economy that is rooted in abundance and not scarcity. And who are the people that have the blood memory to be able to conjure that up and create it and cultivate it in ways that create the future that our descendants deserve? And it is our responsibility now, as you know, with our ancestors behind us in this long lineage of people, it is our responsibility to show up now and to honor them and honor their legacy and honor all of the atrocities that they endured, to ensure that their ancestral brilliance finds a new form today. And so that's a question that, you know, I ask you as folks who are listening, is thinking about, is tending that possibility of what that economy of abundance and an Indigenous economy can look like again, and be thinking about who are the beneficiaries of our work, right? Because in this time when there's a, you know, growing wealth disparity, and, you know, the people who are growing the food, brown and Black people, you know, across the globe, this isn't just a North American issue, this is a global issue. You know, who are the beneficiaries of our work? And so I think a really key thing that is really, I guess, centering my work is how are we continuing to cultivate relational food landscapes that are kin-centric and decenter humans. We're living in an era of Anthropocene. We're living in an era where, you know, humans are so centered, but we know that our ancestors had ways of working in right relationship with all of our relations. And so how are we bringing that together in new forms? We're going to bring the ancestral brilliance forward, but we're also going to combine it with new innovation. And all of the Black, Indigenous, and bodies of culture, we have incredible visions that need to be nourished in the regenerative ag system. And it's time for white folks to pass the mic. It's time for white folks to resource us and to get us at the tables. There's also other beings at that table, seen and unseen, that must be there in order for us to really cultivate the future of food that isn't just a crisis of culture. And so I know we have a lot of other things to talk about, but I implore all of you who are listening to remember that somewhere back in your lineage, there was cultural sanity when it came to relational food landscapes. And so how are we bringing forth all of our ancestral brilliance to be able to create that, and not just relying on the blood memory of trauma, traumatized white people who are living in diaspora, so disconnected from any form of cultural sanity that every solution that they come up with is either appropriation of Indigenous technologies or is some repackaged greenwash garbage that actually isn't going to get us anywhere from the current moment. So I don't know, Chris, if you want to riff on that.
Yeah, I can do that a little bit. I think it was really telling when Elga started speaking the language of her people, and I really appreciate that. It's always music to my ears to hear those voices echo through now into this present moment. And it reminds me of something I might have said when I was in an ORFC panel a couple of days ago with Joe Gendai. In my language, there's no word for farmer, or rather, there's no word for farm. And the word for farmer doesn't really mean farmer. So like there's no, like in our language, there was no way for us to conceptualize the idea that there's a place that you grow food and nourishes people, and then there's places that do not. Like that just, it's like trying to divide by zero in our language. Like you just can't. You cannot compartmentalize the pieces that take care of you versus pieces that supposedly do not, and vice versa. Like all the land is worth protecting, all the water is worth protecting, all the air is worth protecting, all your relations are worth protecting. Rowan mentioned, how human centric we are, and Indigenous people tend not to center any single thing because everything is connected to anything else. You can't really put anything in the center. If one thing in the network gets affected, everything else gets affected. And I think that's a concept that, I don't think just Indigenous people should be able to understand. I mean, me coming from a software engineering background and knowing how networks work, like, you guys who might be engineers get it, at least from a certain technical standpoint. And the compartmentalization thing, it's like this peculiar talent that Shawanako, that white people have, that I've written about in my book, about, like, you know, the ability to draw lines across anything, physical, conceptual, you know, geographic lines, lines between gender, line between sexuality, lines between, like, youth and elder, lines, like all these things to divide and compartmentalize everything. Like, it's an endemic part of the culture, this chaotic culture that we have, that is so part of the ocean that we swim in. We think there's no other way to look at the world, and that it's normal. And then we wind up drawing these lines around everything, and it gets us into trouble. It gets you into trouble when you consider the places that you grow food separate from the places where you live, separate from the places where you recreate, separate from the places you consider sacred. It happens when you have regenerative agriculture. When you see a racist element, you decide you're going to draw lines around that and ignore it and hope that everything's going to be okay. When it turns out that if you draw those lines the way, say, regenerative agriculture does, which is more line drawing, like, you know, you have this kind of spherical indigenous worldview that includes techniques and technology. Regenerative agriculture takes that piece, the tech, snatches it out, leaves the worldview behind, tries to apply it to the real world, and then wonders why nothing works. And regenerative ag isn't the first part, you know, just talking about agriculture isn't the first part that's borrowed from us. Conventional agriculture, everything, just about every part of conventional agriculture that's supposed to be slowing the rate of decline, like when you look at things like contour planting, riparian buffers, ICO forestry, you know, intercropping, like, you know, all this stuff that's happening, no-till, especially, like that, like all of these things are pieces of various indigenous tech that have been extracted from from the womb of the whole culture, that also included things like self-restraint and not considering resources to be a thing that you just take from. You take those techniques, which are incredibly powerful, and then you mechanize them and you put them in the service of capitalism, and you wind up with the Corn Belt. You wind up with the Central Valley. You wind up running out of water. You wind up burning up your soil in under 100 years. So the results aren't limited to just this newest kind of appropriation of our lifeways. You know, with regenerative agriculture, it's always going to happen when you don't take the whole body of the culture with you. And the problem is, the only people that have, like Rowan says, that blood memory and that understanding of how the entire system works together is us. And yet we're always supposed to be off to the side. Kind of like being the magical colored people who whisper things in the ears of the protagonist, who must always be white, no matter how unqualified they are. That's all I have to say about that.
I think I'd like to riff a little bit, if you don't mind, off of what you just said, Chris. I think there's a lot of weight to what you said, and also Elga for bringing in your the language of your people, right? We know that the languages are the scaffold of this, such a the depth of understanding, the depth of a sense of place, the depth of, you know, of, again, this cultural sanity, that scaffolding of that cultural sanity. And I think in this time, I talk a lot about this with my students and folks who I'm mentoring, is really thinking about, as we work towards reclaiming our, you know, our foodways again, as we're rebuilding cooperative, indigenous economies, working with, you know, holistically from seed to table, not seeing them as separate, but as this whole continuum of, you know, the village, you know, economy, is thinking about the need for a new lexicon for the way in which we speak to this work. You know, I always cringe when people talk about that I'm in food systems work, because I don't see my work as that, right? I see that we're culture workers. Like, we are raising up that next generation who don't just think that Earth as mother is a metaphor. Like, that is a spiritual relationship that we tend, you know, the ways in which we see our seeds as our children, you know, that not only are there our children, but in our cosmologies, we are lineal descendants of the foods that end up on our plate. And so the way in which we address them, a way in which we interact with them, the way in which we relate to them is so fundamentally different, right? And they tried their hardest, you know, the colonial powers that be, to try and sever that connection and infect us with this spiritual virus that allows people to be able to, in some crazy way, to see the world as a backdrop of dead, inanimate objects, but it's not, right? We have an understanding of animacy. And so how are we, you know, in this time, not only Indigenous people, we have a language that is very relational, that speaks to this understanding, but how is that being translated into English that's so linear, that's so compartmentalized, that's so extractive? And so how can we, what are the ways in which we can create this new lexicon, so instead of imprisoning ourselves into choices and compartments and pathways of these exploitative and extractive systems, what are their new phrases and words in English or other languages that we can begin to uplift and amplify that really encapsulate what we're talking about, right? And so I'm always kind of grappling with that. So that's another question I ask you as listeners, is to be thinking about what is this new lexicon where we can be talking about this. Because, you know, if Indigenous peoples are doing food systems work, it's not accurate, actually. It's bigger than that. It's such a bigger, more depth, you know, it's a much more complex endeavor, which means that we can't revitalize our gardens and our foodways without teaching the language while we're doing that, right? Without, you know, understanding that our agricultural cycle is a ceremonial cycle in and of itself. And how are we revitalizing, you know, those, you know, that understanding, that body of culture. And that's not just for us alone. Every person on the planet has that. So how are we going back to that and bringing forth that through the way in which we speak and language this? Because otherwise, again, we're just going to keep getting, you know, yeah, just hollow, you know, just a husk of what it is we're speaking to. So I'm always talking about reseeding our imagination, because Black and brown people have incredible imaginations and incredible visions of what the future can be, because our blood memory is what allows that to be. And I'd love to hear, I don't know if Helga has you know, things to offer in that way in terms of our ancestral brilliance and imagination for dreaming a new, you know, future of food.
As you were speaking, you know, it kind of like connected me to how we have sustained ourselves, and how we continue to innovate, and how we continue to teach our new generations. And how do we keep them connected with everything that is pulling them away from our core as Native people? And to me, it always comes back to our self-determination. That is what makes us, that's our resilience, and that's what brings us together and binds us, not only as community, but binds us to our ceremonial calendar and not stray from it. As I was raising my children, who are grown adults with their own children now, I chose to pull them out of public education systems here in the United States, in the Southwest even. Why? Because I was like, they're telling you nothing but lies. They're not saying our stories and our massacres and our genocide. And these are the facts. And good thing that I had strong parents like that when I was in school, and go over lessons, and they would tell me, well, that's not really accurate, and this is the truth of our history. So it's always been that self-determination and how we want to live our lives and how we choose to educate with truth to our generations. So I think that has a lot to do with our resilience in who we are. The language I spoke connects my lineage back 19 generations. And for me to be able to speak it fluently, to be able to connect with my elders, to pass it on to my children and my grandchildren, is the resistance and the self-determination that I bring as a person of Huahuiltecan, Azteca, Mexica, Chichimeca lineage. And at any time and many times, forces that be tried to pull me. But I was so grounded with my ceremonial agricultural calendar because, as Rowan said, that's what it is. We honor all of the movements throughout our seasons. So that in itself, I think just that self-determination, that no matter what is thrown at us, we are not giving up who we are. We are not giving up our migration stories. We are not going to be told that science, and we said, well, who were the actual scientists here? Who gave us the number 0 but the Mayan culture? So it takes us back to our way of being taught, and it comes back to honoring all of those sacred elements that we need to survive. Wind, water, land, sun, moon movements, all of the universal powers that happen, and teaching them and keeping them close to our everyday struggle in growing food and maintaining its sacredness. So I always come back to that self-determination of people and that bottom-up approach to continuing to live who we are and how we want to educate our next generations. And I just want to say, as to what Chris had said about the word farmers, the closest we come to it is chinashli, which means the seed that germinates. So for us too, you know, it was a communal, and continues to be a communal way of life. I have family members in Central Mexico, in the villages of Ocotepec, in Amatlan, where communal farming still exists. There is no tillers. They still farm with the rains, and the most, they still farm with the oxen. So every time I go back to my father's village areas, and get to see how throughout all these generations, our native language is spoken there, not Spanish. How we continue to farm in those ancient methods, and how they continue to celebrate agriculture, life, seed, water, all of those elements through a ceremonial agricultural calendar. And again, through all the genocide that we have been put through, that still exists, brings tears to my eyes every time I'm there. Thank you.
I just want to celebrate what you just said, Elga, in the sense that you are a woman of integrity, and that you are an example of the way in which our indigeneity holds us, right? The way in which anything that you do, you know, all of the people on this panel, anything that we do is an echo not only from our ancestors, but we are held accountable and we are responsible to people, right? And that keeps us in integrity. It keeps us in making good decisions on behalf of being a responsible descendant and a future ancestor. That governs the way in which we move in the world. And we live in a world right now where there are a lot of people who have no idea who they are, where they come from, who they're being held accountable by and to, and who the beneficiaries of their work are. And so they act in unbelievably violent and destructive ways that is so short-sighted, because they don't have I guess the blessing of responsibility has been severed. And so when we, you know, I get a lot of questions about how are, you know, European descendant people, you know, trying to find their way back into that. And I think it can start very small. We have to remember that how can you begin to weave yourself back into a cosmology of cultural sanity again. And I am so grateful for all of the people against all odds who continued to uphold their cultural and original agreements and allow that to echo out in new ways. And so I just want to celebrate you, Elga, and the work that you do and the way that you carry that dignity of your people in your work. And that's the invitation that for all those who are listening is remembering that, this rugged individualism and the disease of that, that we're seeing in COVID times and in the way that we're seeing in our food system is a spiritual disease, and it will cause incredible, it already has caused incredible destruction, but it will continue to careen us off a cliff with a lot of costs. And so how can we remember who it is that we are, held accountable by and to, and walk in that way in integrity is an important question to ask ourselves right now in this moment.
I think it was, I'm really glad, Elga, you brought up ceremony and that Rowan, you brought up individualism, because I think that's the kernel of what's wrong with our culture. I think there's a question in the chat that basically asks, how do we fix this? And I think one of the first things is to understand exactly what's broken. Me working in this kind of farm to table space, like you see how powerful this culture that has been produced from trauma and in some cases being kicked out of Europe and coming over here as second sons and mercenaries and just coming here to take, and sometimes coming here basically as a prisoner, and all the baggage and memory that comes with that. You see that in this dominant society's wariness of one another. Individualism for us is just born of a fundamental mistrust of everyone else. We vest everything we hold sacred in single people, and it's gotten worse, as we go on. Like, you see, like, the institutions that did exist, like, the churches are collapsing and community centers are collapsing, and the few times that this modern society has come together, which is usually around war, the closest we ever got to a kind of progressive, really thinking about the benefit of the society came because we had the Depression followed by World War II, and people thought, well, the world's going to end, so I guess we got to do something. That's the only time. And it took so little time for that to erode because there's no foundation behind it. The ceremonies that we have around our seeds, around our planting, around feeding one another, protecting one another are older than anything that I know of. And I think that's the heart of what makes our society so resilient, is that the core of what makes us is not vested in any one person. It's vested in this notion of ceremony and collective culture, that we're accountable to one another, that we're not just accountable to ourselves, that it's not just about, let me get everything I can get and then somehow the benefits trickle down to everybody. It's no, like, you have to actually be thinking about how your actions affect everyone all the time, because they always do. And I think we're finding our culture to be so brittle because we don't have that. When you invest what a society is in each and every single individual person and make them an island unto themselves, they're very easy to pick off. And we've seen that tactic used against us as people. Our community-owned landscapes were deliberately broken up. That's what the Allotment Act was. That's what the Dawes Act was. It was designed to isolate us in our poverty, in our grief from, our society's collapsing because diseases are taking away 90% of everybody. But the only way to actually get us, to go away and for termination to do its work and for us to become US citizens and become assimilated into society was to turn us from communities, from nations into individuals, so that we could be taken one at a time. And I don't think people out there who aren't in our cultures, who haven't been subjected to that so directly, don't realize that that's what's happening to them. That's what's happening to everybody else. That's where the despair is coming from. That's where the anxiety is coming from. This chronic foreboding that has people attacking their own damn capital. Like, that's where it comes from. Ours is a culture where we have forsaken one another and we're lonely. And nobody wants to admit it because a rugged individualism doesn't tell people that they're sad.
Mm-hmm. And what does, to that point, what does a culture of belonging look like in our food system again, right? That's inclusive, that's diverse, that's representative of all of the many faces and cultures that now reside here in Turtle Island. That's the current reality, is there's a lot of us here now, right? There's a lot of us here. And so what does cultivating that culture of belonging look like? And, to what you're speaking to, Chris, in this moment is that, ultra independence is a trauma response. Like as somebody who works in foodways with Native peoples, I am teaching seed saving workshops and I'm holding people in intergenerational trauma and grief, right? Like it's like a really interesting spectrum of skill sets of having to hold people in this grief and longing. I mean, my own personal story of finding my way home to seeds came through an immense amount of rage and grief and sadness of having been disconnected from that in my life because of the violent legacy of boarding schools and how that impacted my parents and my grandparents and my great-grandparents, right? And so we're all in this time where we need to find our way home again. And food and seed is an incredible multi-sensory way back in, because we imbibe these foods and these drinks and these flavors, and it enlivens memory inside of us that is old and ancient and is sane again. And that comes from a full spectrum of people, no matter where you are on the globe. And so I work interculturally and cross-culturally with Native communities, as well as, people of European descent who want to take workshops. And I think that in a lot of ways, it's really doing the deep somatic work. I love Resma Meniken's work, my grandmother's hands, in just the somatic abolitionism work and the ways in which we need to digest and metabolize the racialized trauma that all of us, carry in these times. And so how can we utilize that, getting ourselves back into our bodies and stop dissociating from living in just a crazy, culture of disconnect and grief, and rooting ourselves back and using those foods as medicines to find our way back home. And I think that is, I was just talking to an Oneida elder this morning, and he said that is one of the pieces that the foods, part of their original agreements, carry to us, which is that they remind us to come together and to take care of each other through feasts and through ceremonies and all of these ways. And so how can we reinvigorate the way in which we nourish and feed ourselves to embody that spirit of taking care of one another?
For myself and our organization, we're in the urban setting of Albuquerque. But New Mexico is home to 23 different Native tribes, and is circled with 19 Native pueblos. So in Albuquerque, at the urban core, we have all of these different tribes, and also those migration stories that continue from our Native relatives in the South. And in the past 2 years, there's been a new Native community introduced in that migration story, African Native Congo nations that are here in Albuquerque now. And for us, it's really re-educating a lot of, as we're building this environmental economy in a new way of looking at food, and continue that intergenerational work in those teachings. It was a sad story, but it was also, they were tears of joy, because at that point, speaking of the Native Congo nations, They are farmers, but farming to them was not the tractor. Farming to them was not having adequate water. It was the same style as in Mexico. And they had brought seeds from their native land in those Congo nations. And they were working with us in some farming, farm training program we have. And at the end of 2 years, after 2 years of getting to know them, of course, we had interpreters, and sometimes we signed, and sometimes heads up, and we started to learn communication patterns. But after 2 years, they came in a ceremonial way with their seeds and said, we'd like to offer these seeds into this new journey. We know we will never make it home again, but we are bringing home with us now, and we are ready to plant these seeds, asking us permission, asking Mother Earth permission, asking the elements to help grow those seeds. It was, to me, one of the most emotional days that I have had, for all of those reasons, as we continue to build and continue to heal from all of our trauma. Racism is hard out there. It is real. It's even being more aggressive towards us. I'm in a safe zone here where I'm at, but 5 hours from here, I don't feel so safe. So it's those pieces. And the other is, now we have international borders that we need to deal with, policies and governments and controlling water. The Rio Grande that separates the southern part of Texas with Mexico. I mean, we fight over that contaminated water. And it is a boundary line. Okay, they put a border wall now, but that river was the border. And so it's healing from all of those traumas. In the 20 years I farmed, and we formed our cooperative in Brownsville, Texas. As I said, it was a militarized zone, a full-blown militarized zone. Stadium, 1,000-watt stadium lights, barriers. We ended up in the no dead zone. We ended up between the wall and the river. And it stayed closed like that for 5 years. So those are the resilience that we continue to work with. Everything that is thrown at us, we continue to find the courage and the energy and all of that it takes to move us past those barriers. So I want to really thank, Rowan and Chris, Farzana, Castaneda, and this platform that we are on to help us bring our story from our words, from our lived experience. And we will continue to navigate our narratives. And that's why, again, I pull my kids out of school, because I was like, you're better off learning from us, our lived experience and how we live and see the world, than receiving those lies, their stories. So all of us that are on this panel, and all of you that are listening in, I think it does come to that collectiveness to connect with what really is at the core of life and what is really at the core of the breath of life. Thank you.
Thank you, Helga. There's always bigness in our conversations that I really appreciate. And I hope everyone listening got a chance to feel that as well. Appreciate your questions. Sorry we cannot answer them directly. I hope this conversation is still meaningful to you. And Castaneda Fellows, Elga, Rowan, and Chris, you are right. and all that you've said. And this is more than the word food systems or regenerative ag can express. And for the future of food, and what we really need is cultural sanity. And I'm just beyond grateful for your work as part of our mission to, shift culture, powers, and structures towards the leadership we need. And each of you and the people seen and unseen in your communal ecosystem are a part of what we most need to listen to right now. And that has always been clear to me, and it continues to be clear. And just really profoundly grateful for your time with us and just embodying a culture of belonging. And as we near close in our 5 minutes in a time where time doesn't mean as much as it used to and is kind of amorphous, what do you need? What final words, things do you want to share, or practices, potential actions can you share with everyone listening to this broadcast that they can take home in their hearts and in their deeds? So if you have one thing with regards to something that they might nourish of the many seeds you planted today, I really just invite you to share that as we close. Whoever wants to go first.
I mean, I can jump in. Thanks everybody for such a lively circle. Please feel free to visit nativefoodalliance.org to support our Native American Food Sovereignty Alliance. We're building regional cooperative seed hubs and indigenous, food distribution and chef and culinary work. So if there's any resources that you can send our way to support our work, please visit our site there. And I will just say this, that each and every one of you is not untouched by the grief of these times, but you're also not untouched by the generosity of many, many indigenous peoples whose legacy fills your plate each and every day. And so ways in which you can honor those indigenous peoples and their legacy by continuing to resource us in all the ways and centering our voices is deeply, deeply appreciated. Helga?
I'll follow up, and I'm totally in agreement with Rowan and her message here as an ask. We are Agricultura Cooperative Network. We're a small-scale farming cooperative and network based out of the South Valley of Albuquerque. And for us, it's respect and understand some of our trauma, and respect that we have survived generations of genocide against us, and understand when we say that we are not disadvantaged and land was stolen, resources were taken, and as Rowan had said, the boarding school, that trauma really has had generational effects on our people, on our land, and that we are still here is the main message, that we have not been erased, and we continue to honor the earth, her resources, our way of life, and maintain a language that, as I said, I was forced to learn 2 other languages. And to be able to speak my language and pray in those ancient ways through ceremony is very important. So respect and much love to all of you. Thank you.
I guess that just leaves me. There's 2 things I want to say. One, Rowan mentioned the concept of food as medicine. And I think that term medicine has a depth that illustrates the difference between and the disconnect between indigenous concepts of things and colonizer concepts of things. And I think it's illustrated really clearly by the CEO of Whole Foods, who recently got in trouble for basically saying that this country doesn't have a healthcare problem. Basically, people just need to eat more organic food and they'll be fine. He boiled down something that Rowan describes as the glue that holds a people together. It's medicine not only in the sense that it keeps your body healthy, it's medicine in the sense that it connects communities. It connects you to the soil. It connects you to the ancestors through that soil. It connects you to everything that is alive and has ever been alive. You know, us being the descendants of that seed, you know, us having that kinship. For us, medicine is a term that's so big, so encompassing that you could talk about it forever. The reason we revere our elders is because they spend their lives understanding it in a way that you can only accumulate with the passage of years. Whereas on the colonizer side, food is just another thing to buy. It's just a thing you buy. There's the healthy kind, there's the unhealthy kind. Pick the right kind, you as the individual, pick it, eat it, and I'm sure you'll be fine. That's the difference. When you're talking about, you know, taking an indigenous concept like medicine and then colonizing it. And the same thing happens when you take something like indigenous ways of making food and then calling it regenerative agriculture and boiling it down to this reductive thing that fits into this fundamentally extractive, unsavable system that we have called capitalism. And I just hope everybody can walk away with that. And the second thing is, in terms of what you can do, please keep it simple. We need your resources. We need your money. We need your land. And that's it. We don't need introductions. We don't need to like be in your circle of best friends or whatever. We don't need technical assistance. We don't need you to dance around the issue. The United States came to being by people stealing 20 acres of land per second for 180 years. That's what we need back. We need the land back, or we need the money to pay the ransom on that land to get it back. And whether that's at the individual level, whether it's at the federal policy level, whether it's somewhere in the middle at the philanthropic or state or regional level, that's what we need. Because people like Elga, people like Rowan, people like me have created very detailed plans about what needs to be done. We have the expertise. We know what we're doing. We have everything we need except the one thing that most people don't want to give up. And that's all.
All right. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.